Okay, we've got really nice audio levels here.
Great.
We're recording.
Great. All right. So let's talk about criticism and the power of words, right? So sticks and stones can break my bones, but words will never hurt me, except when it's critical and you don't have your kind of immune system or defenses up, or perhaps you're just not immune to them ever, or when it's coronavirus and droplets are being spit out of your nasopharyngeal tract. But yeah, those are the only two cases in which words can hurt you. So let's just start raw. What's the deepest criticism that cut the worst that anyone has ever given you?
Me?
Yeah. Across anything. The thing that kind of like plays in your head occasionally. Every once in a while. Across professional, social, romantic, emotional, it can be anything. It could just be like, from third grade. It doesn't even matter if it's real or not. What's the thing that like...
You're going to have to come back to me on that. I'm going to have to be thinking about it for a while. Yeah, there's nothing that just springs to mind. I'm definitely going to have to like meditate on that a little bit.
So what's interesting to me about that is that means that your mind does not constantly upwell previous criticisms on a daily basis.
Right.
No, it just does. It doesn't do that.
No.
Oh, interesting.
It does to you?
Well, so I'll just maybe tell a story then. So like I've gone, in search of like replacement father figures my entire life, one of whom was my PhD advisor, Robert Spolsky. And at one point, in the midst of like kind of a grand experiment gone wrong and kind of a situation where blame, like it was kind of indeterminate where to assign blame across various different things, and people were kind of defending themselves and defending others and defending the science and defending the circumstance and defending the logistics of the whole experimental design. At one point, this proto-father figure told me that I had an undeserved arrogance about me, and that has like at the time, of course, I rejected it, but I like every once in a while like creeps in as something that I'm like terrified of being slightly true, and also from someone you respect. It like hurts more than anything, and like one wonders the amount of time it takes to understand criticism. Sometimes, like there can be definitely criticisms that come from outside that you at the time, perhaps by virtue of the criticism or perhaps because of its accuracy, just simply cannot see. It just takes a while.
Well, I definitely feel that happens. And it's some criticisms it has taken me years to understand. And they're along the same lines, and probably a reason why we have things in common. I have been accused of a certain aloofness, arrogance, narcissism, self-absorption. These are the common threads I heard throughout my life growing up, and have tried very hard to kind of ingest, incorporate, take to heart. I think when you hear things from different people, you have to start taking them seriously if you're at all self-aware. And again, we've talked about like a kind of more expansive narcissism that allows you to actually want to recognize the narcissism because you just deeply want people to like you. And so I think I fall under that category. Like I want people to genuinely like me, and if they think I'm too self-obsessed, then I got to work on that. And it's probably for a deeply narcissistic reason. But it has helped me, and I've been grateful in retrospect, and it has kind of stung at the time, because obviously I think, we all are looking for validation from others. And I think me and you both have like deeply critical minds. And I think that in the sense that criticism is about making distinctions, meaningful distinctions. And obviously we're going to turn that gaze on ourselves for better or worse, whether that becomes, I think there's a fine line obviously between self-obsession and self-awareness, right? And, but when you turn that gaze inward and you become critical of yourself, at some point, hopefully it's constructive, right? We got to talk about the difference between constructive and destructive criticism. And also criticism is, it has a negative connotation, but I think the origin of the word is just judgment, right? It's just discernment.
Sure.
Kritikos, I think, is both Latin and Greek. And so there's both this negative connotation, and then there's there's a sense of it's just a neutral discernment, like when you think of literary criticism or you think of critiques, obviously that's the same, right? Like we're just it's just looking at something carefully and with some level of expertise, we imagine, or some level of, if you have an art critique. And then there's an entire discipline, right, of criticism for the arts, for film, and and then the role of those critics we should talk about. When is it positive and when is it just my deep sense is when it comes to criticism in art, and I borrowed this, I think I learned this from E.H. Gombrich, who was a famous art historian I remember reading, who had a big influence on me. And he said the role of the critic is just to shed light on a work of art that you wouldn't otherwise see. The ideal critic opens up new ways of looking at something that open up possibilities of meaningfulness. When you are ignorant of the history of art, and you just look at a painting and it just looks like, oh, my kid could do that, especially with abstract art, you always have that criticism of the layperson. The expert critic hopefully can illuminate the piece in a way that will allow you to see it more deeply and appreciate it more. I think if the critic is just self-aggrandizing by thinking that he or she is better than the piece by criticizing it negatively, it doesn't really do much good, right?
Do you know about a Ulysses contract? Have you heard of this?
No.
It's a thing that it's more common in like the mental health circles these days, but it came from the Odyssey, and it was this kind of like when Odysseus was like confronting the sirens and knew of them, he had set up, like a tie me up to the mast because I know what's about to happen, and I know future me is going to want to succumb to the sirens that are off in the water. And so whatever I say, however much I plea or implore you, do not untie me from the mast, right? Mm-hmm. So I have a Ulysses contract. So it's often used in like mental health. Actually, it's actually very interesting legally because it's people that have episodic mental illnesses will sometimes set up Ulysses contracts with hospitals or doctors, which is to say, right now I'm lucid, but if and when I become manic, if and when I become bipolar, if and when I have a schizophrenic break, you have my consent and permission to do X, Y, Z. Mm-hmm. You have consent and permission to treat me. So I have a Ulysses contract with a friend in San Francisco before I moved to LA, and it has 2 clauses. And if I violate the Ulysses contract, they are allowed to pull me, have an intervention and pull me back to San Francisco. Clause number 1 is if I ever date an influencer. And clause number 2 is if I ever become a critic.
Really?
In 5 years, if I'm dating an influencer or if I become a critic, they're allowed to just cut my life off at the roots and replant me back in San Francisco. And so I deeply have this like problem with discernment and discernment alone, because of course art and like the decision making to make any artistic piece is about like choosing on some level. And I do kind of like connecting the critic to the artist, but I deeply and desperately feel that my downhill inertia in life would be to become a critic and do nothing more, like to watch a movie and then write about it, and then watch another movie and then write about it, and then watch another movie and write about it, and just like till the end of time. I don't want to do that. I want to make the thing.
I sat with a really nice woman on the airplane once, and she was telling me, I told her I was a filmmaker, and she said that her daughter so loved movies and wanted to become a critic because she just wanted to watch and write about movies. And then when she went to school for it, she realized everybody was just trying to one-up each other on how cleverly they could destroy a movie. Right. And it was so disheartening that she just gave up on it because she did that. And the other big influence on me was the Cahiers du Cinéma, which was like in the 50s, before Godard and Truffaut and Romer and all these people were able to have enough money and influence to make movies. All they could do is write about them. So they would watch, several movies a day, and write about them intelligently in the cinema notebooks. And their basic philosophy was don't write negative reviews because they don't do any good. Just ignore a movie if it's not good enough to write about. And if a movie's, but they thought that there was a lot of depth in places where people weren't seeing depth. So they were taking American B movies, later termed film noirs, right? And Hitchcock films, which were just considered commercial fare. And they said, no, there's a deep kind of reflection of what's going on in the underbelly of American culture there. And we can like expose that. and show like certain undercurrents in the culture, we can show that Hitchcock is a great artist, not just a commercial, craftsman.
Yeah.
And
I mean, you almost have more power as a critic to resurrect the like kinds of art in a culture. I mean, Moby Dick died alone and poor, right? Like it took decades for the arts to be resurrected.
You mean
Herman Melville? Sorry,
Melville.
Yeah.
The whale died.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't even in his like obituary, right? But I mean, it took kind of critical revisiting to resurrect it, and so in some sense, that is more powerful than the art itself, to be able to curate and control the path that art takes to society, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I feel similarly about criticism. I think it sounds like you do too, as well as we do about boundaries, right? On the one hand, we want to like reject it, we could be dismissive of it. I remember there was a great story of Antonioni being on a talk show in Italy, and there was this critic who had destroyed his last movie. And Antonioni said, it's just so ironic that you hated my movie so much, because I loved your last movie enormously, And the guy looked confused, and he said, "What do you mean? I've never made a movie?" And he said, "Exactly." And I remember I worked for, I had the great privilege of working for Vittorio Storaro, who's the cinematographer who won Academy Awards for, he did Apocalypse Now and all of Bertolucci's films, and he and his crew were so passionate about film, and they would watch a movie every day after work, no matter how long they'd work. They'd watch a film, and they would never say negative things about a movie, because they said, we know there's so much that goes into a movie that you have to be just arrogant and blind to not learn something from any movie. And I do think that criticism has been rightly given a bad name, because I think people are too self-aggrandizing, and they feel clever in their ability to dismiss, and ability to just dismiss out of hand too, which, that is the most infuriating thing. Because if somebody gets deep meaning from something and it touches them in a certain way, to then hear somebody like, haughtily and arrogantly just say it's worthless, it makes them feel better about themselves, and it makes the person who likes it feel worse. Like, oh, maybe I'm dumb for liking this.
Right.
And I just think that's just a waste of everybody's time. Like,
I've met people whose entire personality is defined by things they dislike,
right?
As opposed to things they like. Like I find that too easy and simple, and to even bring up. Do you like, if you had to, on balance, define your personality as things you like versus things you dislike, because those are both kinds of discrimination, right? Those are both kinds of discernment.
Right.
You can be a wine drinker who likes a certain thing or dislikes a certain thing. You can be a fan of certain literature that, just simply the things you bring up, the things you mention are things you dislike. But I find myself like, it's so much harder to find joy in things. And it's almost like such a more worthwhile emotion to find pleasure in failed ambition, or someone who tried but failed at a thing. Do you think it requires knowledge? So do you think you have to be a filmmaker yourself in order to understand the difficulty of making a film, and therefore find in even an ambitious failure its kind of beauty?
No.
Like, is there like, so one thing I worry about and wonder about is, like, in order for me to, across all disciplines, across all kind of crafts and arts, and even just people as I meet them, like, in order to find the purest joy and the best parts of them, I do wonder the degree to which I need to have the skill required to become them in some sense, or like do a similar thing that they did, in order to understand what makes it so hard, and therefore like learn the lesson from it, as opposed to just criticize it, because it's so easy.
Yeah, and there's a concept of hamburger criticizing, which is like, you're supposed to like the meat is the criticism, and then the buns are the compliments.
Oh yeah, of course.
And you should like
I call people out on that if they try to do that to me all the time. Like in writing and in my job and career and profession, I like when people start with a compliment, I'm like, really? You think, like, first of all, I haven't heard this? I'm like 36. I've fucking heard this before. Like, I know exactly what you're going to do, the compliment sandwich.
Right.
You really think that's going to like work on me? You think I'm not just going to like go right to it?
What's going to happen? You're just going to only pay attention to the criticism?
Well, no, I'm just going to be insulted that they thought it would work on me. I mean, that's like an easy psychological, like,
have you ever tried to hamburger that response though?
Oh, that's
Say,
good.
I know you mean well in in what you're doing.
I've heard you say such
you're a
smart things
fucking idiot.
previously. But that was a bit simple. I mean, it was well said. It was very articulate.
But so there's this deep thing of discernment. If you just liked everything, you would, or even just disliked it. I think they're obviously opposite sides of the same coin. If you're undiscriminating in your like and dislike, they're probably equally annoying and uninformative, right? If you just walked around gaga getting joy out of everything, or if you just hate everything, neither of those would be people you'd like to listen to, maybe.
Yeah.
Even the people who say they won't say something negative, it's because they're looking carefully for the positive things to say, maybe.
Right.
There's a skill, I think, as far as your question about whether we should, you need to be able to make a movie or make music to criticize it. I don't think that's the case, but you do need the deep skill of watching or listening.
Yeah.
Even if that making music could help you develop that skill, but I think it can also be developed from just a lot of listening and learning to make meaningful distinctions, which is what it comes down to, right?
Yeah.
And helpful distinctions. And I think that we then want to illuminate those for other people who want to hear it. That's also like, there's some people who hate reading reviews. And, it's famous, like a friend of mine worked for Woody Allen for many years before becoming Oliver Stone's producer. And I worked with Oliver Stone, and I got to become friends with this wonderful guy, Eric Kopelov is his name. And he told me that his job as a little, intern in the at the beginning of working for Woody Allen in the editing room was to go through the newspaper and any reviews or, gossipy things about Woody Allen, cut them out and throw them away. Like most people would want someone to cut them out so they can keep it and have that validation of, I'm being written about. But Woody Allen wanted to be able to open the New York Times and be 100% certain he wasn't going to read anything about himself or about his movies. And
but looking at the surface area which was removed probably feels good as it gets larger and larger over time, right? Like he could see what was cut out and probably felt quite good about that. But I bet the person cut out a little too much sometimes just to make him feel good. Even if nothing was in there.
I'll ask him. But no, I think he genuinely didn't find it helpful to read. He thought once the movie was done, he obviously thought he could learn enough from the process watching the movie. He believed in his own discernment, and could recognize his mistakes and obviously move on and learn from that more than learning from or more than being affected by what other people have to say about it. I love reading reviews when I really enjoy a movie. I'll then go home and read all the reviews I can.
Absolutely. I read them during the movie sometimes.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
The first time I watched 8.5, for example, which I now consider one of the top 5 films of all time, Fellini, right? The first time I watched it, I was 19 or 20 in college, and I found it completely incoherent. Mm-hmm. I didn't understand what was happening, right? And so I went to the library and looked up like a PhD thesis that had been written about it. And it was like 100-page, and I just ate this up. And I was like, wow, there's all these layers of meaning, and there's like these 4 different themes that are happening, and there's the kind of about time and about the creative process. And then I watched the movie again, and suddenly my mind was just blown by the genius of it, right? And this was like, and then I could watch the movie over and over again and find these things and delight in them. And then, of course, Bert Dreyfuss taught this course, Existentialism in Literature and Film, which had a huge influence on me and was the reason I became a filmmaker. It was like when the first time there was university, iTunes University, and people were like putting their lectures online. Dreyfuss was one of the first people to do that, and you can still go and find these lectures because it was like one of the top 10 for a long time. And he was finding really deep philosophical, again, like kind of undercurrents and reflections of what it was meant to be human at that time through like deep analysis of these movies. And this taught me the idea that you can watch a movie, it's inexhaustible. You can watch it like 10, 20, 30 times and each time learn more from it. And if you talk to people who are much smarter than you and read them and see the things that they see, all of a sudden when you watch it, the movie looks different, right? Mm-hmm. it's been shown that they do studies where they show films to people who've never watched movies, right? If in tribes or something, and then they're looking at the wrong thing. They're looking at a chicken in the corner, and they're not following even the story. So we develop these skills, and to me, criticism is a way of further like attuning yourself to different like meaningful things that are happening in the movie and making the experience all the more rich and fulfilling.
So you would count that kind of like just theory as under the umbrella broadly of criticism. So like, because criticism, the discernment part, like in the PhD thesis, they probably don't say, I liked this version.
Right.
Or I liked this scene.
Right.
You know, that's too simple. It's not about their opinion. It's not about the worth or merit of the thing. It's the theory.
And that's why, so we've made the distinction by taking in the French word critique, right? Instead of, it's the same word, criticism and critique. But when in English now, the word critique seems to like evoke more just careful consideration of something rather than just the negative of criticizing, right?
Right.
So critiquing is different from criticizing.
So soon we should talk about the criticism.
It's a nuanced discernment there, right?
So I want to come back to the criticism we've received on this podcast up until, through 30 episodes. Uh-huh. But before that, do you think, so I only have one kind of art, which is I write. And as I write, I don't know why or how I edit sentences, but effectively what I'm doing is 1% artist, 99% critic. Where I see a sentence, I see a paragraph, I see a page, I see a story, I see a character, I see an arc, I see a thing. And I hate it and I try to revise it until I find it palatable. And so I do actually feel like most of the actual act, the metabolic act of making art in some sense, or making at least when I write, is me criticizing my own writing as it unfolds. And so I like, as much as I say, oh, here's my Ulysses contract, pull me back if I'm a critic, I actually feel deeply that most of what I do when I write a sentence well was I criticized the 200 versions of the sentence before until it became something that I found okay. So do you feel, you told this great story the other day about Walter Murch talking about, a scene is done editing when you hit the, cut frame and it's the same a few times in a row.
Yeah. Something
like that. You'll tell it better. But do you think that in the process of that, a editor is criticizing their own scene, their own work?
Well, so this is why I hate writing so much. I've thought about this a lot. Like when I play music, I can get better and better at it without thinking about it. Mm-hmm. And you get this sense of like fluency, and then you can play the piece more and more, thoughtlessly. No, that's not the wrong word, but just fluidly, right? But writing, every time you do have to keep taking this kind of detached, although I imagine there are people who do get into that sense of flow while writing, but it does seem like every sentence is always new. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you're playing music, you can repeat and you can like go into this place of just feeling and like your body knowing it, right?
Yeah. And there's something almost tragic about the sentence. Once it's written, you go back and revise that, whereas like as you play music, you don't go back and revise the chord you played minutes ago.
And this is why writers maybe all commit
goes
suicide.
Into the ether, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's something deeply like, and it's a bit like life itself, right? You just get this first draft and then that's it. You don't get to like redo things.
Yeah.
In any meaningful way.
So I've written I've published maybe 5,000 words publicly. Let's like out there. Maybe let's say 10,000. I've published 10,000 to my name.
Yeah. Where can people find these words?
There's
a little self
I don't know,
promotion.
They're in the New Yorker. They're in Slate. They're all the LA Review books. But it's like nonfiction essays, right? And I have occasionally gone back and read them. I've occasionally just been like, what did I used to be like? Like how did I used to write as I try to now write books and novels and things. And of all of the paragraphs I have ever written, of all of those 10,000 words, I think I've probably read them like years hence. There's only one paragraph I find that is good.
And you think that now in 10 years you're going to hate it maybe?
Perhaps. I think there's one paragraph that I've written that stands out. And it's the only paragraph I don't remember writing.
Interesting.
So I, right before I published, it was this article about the World Cup and whether or not you could predict. It was a Jonathan Swiftian satire article about whether or not you can predict World Cup success by parasitic infection rates, countrywide parasitic infection rates. And I was going into surgery the day the article came out. I literally put in the last draft, put in the final edits. When I woke up, the piece came out. And so in the hours in between, so surgery, the anesthesia has like a retrograde amnesia. I was literally in the gown typing the final edits to that final paragraph before I sent it out. And when I woke up, it was there, and I don't remember writing the last paragraph. Whoa. And it's the only one that I read that I think, and this is kind of like odd in trying to understand what it means to read your own writing and what it means to be your own critic. It's the only thing that I read that doesn't, because I don't remember writing it, it feels like someone else wrote it.
I was just going to say that.
And therefore, I'd like, oh, that's good. And so everything that I've written, I imagine, because I kind of remember having written it, and I remember the counterfactual sentences, and I want it to be better than it is, in kind of the way that like Woody Allen, when Manhattan was finally cut, I think he asked his studio to never release it. He's like, I will make you 3 movies if you never release Manhattan, because he hated it so much, because relative to what he had imagined the film being in the beginning, the end result was just paled in comparison to what the vision in his head. So every single sentence I read that I remember writing, I wanted it to be better, and it ended up in some like laborious cut down edited form. But the one thing I don't remember writing, I find palatable, and I find that so weird and so troubling.
You've also said that you always forget everything that we talk about as soon as the podcast is
over.
Yeah,
this is like a nice fugue state for me.
And it's also interesting to compare writing to speaking, right?
Yeah.
Because
I can't edit what I say.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's more like music.
Yeah.
And I enjoy it much more because you're just committing as you go.
Yeah.
And I'm as surprised as the next person as to what the next word that's going to come out is going to be. And in a way, it's a reflection of everything I've learned and done in my life, and it's completely unrehearsed. And I think that's what makes these podcasts interesting to people. They feel that immediacy and that skillfulness that is editable.
And I do wonder if, like how I said, as you write, what you're doing is mostly critic, like 1% artist, 99% critic. I do wonder as I speak, or as we speak, or as anyone speaks, like we could just say random things. I don't know why I say the words that I say. I have no idea. They just come out. But I feel like part of the discernment of why I do end up saying some things is I'm desperately afraid of being thought of as uninteresting, or I'm desperately afraid of my own critical evaluation of the sentence right after I say it, right? And so I do wonder if I'm just being shaped by my own, like anxious self-criticism along the path. And so people think about like, oh, where do words come from? It must sui generis. They just appear out of the ether like bubbles and sea foam. But no, they are just the only thing left over after you've criticized every other option of what to say. Yeah.
And for those of you anxiously awaiting the Walter Murch story, lest we forget, Walter Murch, first of all, is a giant of filmmaking, of editing, which is the most unglamorous and yet most important, I think, craft in filmmaking, because it's the one thing that's pretty much unique to filmmaking. So it gets at the essence of it, and Walter Murch worked with Coppola mainly, most famously, but also just did so many great films. Look him up if you don't know him. But what's really great about him is that on top of being a brilliant editor and sound editor, he's just a deep thinker about like cinema as a phenomenon. Not as an art form, and so I just ate up his words because he's a philosopher of cinema in addition to being a great craftsman, which is really unusual. Like people who feel to write and talk about their work as well as they are able to do the work. Because often we've kind of hinted at this already. You've got the critics who maybe can't do and are frustrated by that and taking out that frustration on the people who they're jealous of. I think there's definitely some of that going on often.
I've had beautiful conversations with him. I met him a few times about the similarity between film editing and gene editing and the biological like span of a organism, and like you cut up little genes in the same way that you cut up little film reel, and it was beautiful. Like it was his philosophy, right? And it was him making these connections and ideas over to science, and he speaks with molecular biologists as enthusiastically as he speaks with other filmmakers, and he just like, I think he's a great philosopher of our time.
And I think so anyone who wants to make movies, in any capacity, whether it's directing, editing, shooting, like read Walter Murch, because
In the blink of an eye.
he would say things too that at the time would feel really obscure. And I think like, how do you even notice this or think about it? Like, make cuts on non-vocalized consonants. It seems like such like p or k, right? Like consonants that don't have your voice with it.
Right.
So that's just like a pop, right? With p. And this is one of the most useful pieces of advice I've ever encountered as an editor, because you want to make the cut in a way that sometimes disappears. And since that sound is a way of like, it's kind of a cut in life and you don't realize it, but it just goes really well, that sound with and cut to another point of view.
Yeah.
And
hence the blink of an eye in the title, right? A blink is a cut in life that we don't notice.
Exactly.
The whole point is to not notice the cut, right?
Yeah, which is a problem with Hollywood editing.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, they fell into that as being the only thing, whereas the Russians and the avant-garde in the 20s, they were saying they had this dialectical view of editing where you should bring attention to it as the essence of cinema, and we should create conflict, and the edit should be as jarring as possible. And that's a different philosophy, which is also worth considering. But so Walter Murch says also very usefully that you should. First of all, you shouldn't touch the footage until you've watched it all at least 10 times. And that, I think, illustrates how important it is to have deep understanding and knowledge of what you're working with, your materials.
Critical understanding?
Yes, I think so.
What
and
else?
Also
what
just
else?
the visceral understanding of it, like when you really know it, when you just like,
Sure.
like what's there and what's available for you. And so watch all the footage 10 times. And then obviously you have to decide, let's say in a very straightforward scene, you have to decide when is this shot going to end and when is the new one going to begin. So he says he would do this on the moviola, which is the old way of editing movies, where the actual film was going through this machine and you'd have to like stop and start it. I think you did it with your feet at the time. He would always work standing up, even still as a digital editor. He thought you have to have your body in it. And so sitting is like makes you less engaged. Very Heideggerian, very being in the world, right? So he has to, he would stand up, and then with his body, he would watch the scene, and then he would hit the space bar today and with the computer to stop where he felt the scene should stop. It's very much like music too, obviously. And there are 24 frames in a second of a film, at least in traditional, celluloid. And you would think if you stop on 1/24th of the second, after 3 seconds and 4 frames, it would be exactly the same as if it was 5 frames. Like, can we really discern the difference between 1/24th of a second and another 24th of a second? According to Walter Murch, if he just hits that space bar a few times and it doesn't land on the exact frame, he hasn't yet found the right place for that to be. And that gives me chills, because it's exactly what this is the positive side of what we're talking about, criticism, of really having a deep intuition and feeling of what's right and what works.
Yeah.
And having that be with your body, not just with your mind, not just with your intellect, but really just feeling that, right?
Yeah. And so I think on a non-trivial level, what's happening is he's saying like, you have to align all of your inner critics. Mm-hmm. And once they're aligned, you're at the right spot, right?
But I think I think our the fact that we're suspicious of critics is this idea of it being a removed, third person, right, uninvolved, I think there's a deep feeling that the artist is in it enough and not the critic, and that's why we should maybe trust the artist more than we trust the critic. The critic has this outsiderness which makes us rightly sometimes mistrust them. And so that's why I think we should make a distinction between the critic and the artist, because the involvement of the artist gives and being from the inside instead of from the outside is a fundamentally different posture to have, I think.
I've never heard it better said. So as a neuroscientist, I've spent a long time trying to just find a palatable basic definition of just what sad is. And someone who was suffering from clinical depression told me that how they felt it, the phenomenology of their severe depression, was as if they were always on trial for a war crime internally. Mm-hmm. They had a critic. They had a critic inside their head that continually told them that something was wrong, that what they had done was wrong, that they were wrong, that everything they did was wrong, right? And it's this thing where like that's not like I'm just kind of commenting on you saying that our reservation is about their outsiderness, but that when you internalize this as the artist, or as you internalize this like with anxiety, or you maybe do with certain emotions, you internalize the critic and you don't stop talking about it, right? And they like kind of overpower. They can overpower. So I thought it was interesting when you said you didn't know the thing that, you know, the criticism that had cut the deepest right away. But I guarantee you there's a kind of person that would know right away.
Right.
If you asked that question to them, they would have the answer ready. And that's because they're probably an anxious person.
And that's why I'm a happy person. You think maybe I'm a generally happy person.
Well, so I have found in relationships it easier sometimes when you're unpacking the why, like in romantic relationships, when I'm trying to, in a, I guess an argument, but it doesn't have to be that strongly worded. But when you're trying to figure out kind of why something happened or what was behind that behavior, those partners that I've been with that are anxious already, that are inclined towards anxiety, have the answer pre-ready, preheated, because their brain has spent a long time already thinking about what they did wrong, right? And so the answer is just there, it's present. And so I do think there's a sense in which there's a kind of mental model of a critic that we keep to ourselves. We can share it, I guess, just dyadically to another person, or sometimes it finds its way all the way into its art, and sometimes you just take it out on society, or you take it out on the art around you. You know, you kind of silence the inner critic in order to, I guess, give stage to the just nasty outside critic.
And I think the original meaning of the critic and in Greek or Latin, I don't remember. It was the same as judge.
Yeah.
I think, and it has to do with, we have this idea of justice and judgment coming together too, right? So there's a certain like moral aspect which we haven't really talked about, right? Which is we should criticize our own behavior and the behavior of others on moral grounds as well. You know, if we were free from that, we would live in a world where, I mean, who knows? This that goes to your sense of what human nature is when it's not, when it's unleashed, right? There's a more conservative view, which is that you need to judge and hold people back from their basest instincts.
Yeah.
And that criticism is a part of that. Or there's a sense that maybe if we let ourselves flourish in a way that's free from criticism. And then this kind of goes into the kind of California cliche of like, oh, don't be so judgmental, right? That's like a bad thing to be judgmental. People are judgmental of judgmentalism. And I'm being a child of two worlds, of California and of Italy. In Italy, I think criticism is paralyzing. I think there's this sense that nobody will do anything because they're like Romans especially are so deeply critical of everybody and everything, and they just love to talk badly about other people and gossip, and they love to be dismissive of ideas. And you say, I want to do this thing, and everyone's like, it's impossible. And part of it is the weight of like thousands of years of things that have been done so amazingly well that you could never live up to it. And I think that it becomes paralyzing to a culture. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Greeks, the Egyptians, the Italians, like all these cultures that have this massive history that is such a huge like shadow to live in, have had more difficulty creating things that are really fresh and new. You know, like there hasn't been a tradition of great like modern architecture in Rome, right? In Paris, which doesn't have as much ancient remains, there's able to be newness. And I've always loved about California this idea that you can do anything. And I remember having this idea of the school bus filled with editing systems and like traveling around and talking about that in Italy, and everyone just looks at you like you're crazy. And like it's just something you could never do. I could never do what I'm doing here with the compound and the trailers and Bombay Beach, and all these things would be absolutely impossible in a culture that's too critical, I think.
Yeah.
So I think there's an opposition between criticism and freedom, right?
Right.
That we need to find a balance of, because then there's also the cliche of the California New Agey, like everything is beautiful and like, which is equally paralyzing in its own way, right?
There's a brilliant woman who spent a year on a break from the neuroscience program that I was in, the PhD program, and she moved down to LA, and I got this text message from her like 10 months later. I'm moving back. I walked into a bookstore and they organized their books by color. And so she's just like, I'm out. And I once in San Francisco, there's some pen something literary festival, the Lit Fest, I forget, Litquake, they call it something. And I think the town full of kind of literary hobbyists. And there was this keynote, and the guy said, I think he used the phrase Quixote-like instead of Quixotic, which is its own word.
Quixotic, isn't it?
You can say it. Yeah, there you go. Discernment. And I remember thinking at a literary festival, the keynote speaker in this town saying Quixote-like. I'm like, okay, I'm out. And so there's this time that like everyone has a threshold, and it's so arbitrary and it can be so petty, so fucking
and snobby,
and so snobby, and it's a kind of like, okay, I'll turn the question about receiving criticism back. What's the harshest criticism you've ever given?
Although this is something I've been thinking about in the back of my mind, that I do have a tendency sometimes to give unsolicited advice or criticism to people that I've had to check. I do have a desire sometimes to fix annoying features of people that I love. Someone pointed out recently that I love by criticizing. Mm-hmm. And that if you know me well enough, you'll recognize that it's actually a loving gesture, but it can be a little jarring or impolite maybe. And so I think also with age and intuitiveness, you hopefully learn to be discerning in when to dish it out, right? And like don't offer it if it's not asked for, right? So yeah, no, I've definitely been a little cutting, and it is always with people that I love deeply. So I hope
it's probably what hurts the most, right?
Right. No, it's just like I find little things that people do annoying, and I might point it out, and like, why? Who am I? Like, I should definitely I think as a general rule of thumb, like we should be aware of when our opinion is wanted, right? Yeah. That's obviously the critic can write, and then people can read it if they want and not read it if they don't want, right?
But it's so different when it's told right to your face by someone you love. Yeah. It gets devastating.
Yeah. I think I'm probably the worst. I'm the worst of this with my mother, because we're the most unfiltered, and we also recognize in our parents like things that we don't like about ourselves.
Oh yeah, it's always about you fundamentally.
Yeah. So like you want to like not, you recognize this thing that you hate, and you realize that it's something that might have rubbed off on you, and maybe you can fix it in them, and then by osmosis fix it in you. Right.
As if there's like a kind of transgenerational transfer of knowledge, power, or traits that can happen even at adulthood. Yeah. Right. Like if you fix the trait in your parent, you somehow are it's removed of you from you as well. Yeah. No, it doesn't work like that. Elegance comes from Latin eligare, which means the same root we get election from. To choose and to choose well. And I think that's a kind of discernment, right? And
I want to pay a second little homage to an old dearly departed friend who was famous for being the harshest critic in the world of criticism. His name was A. Gill. Are you familiar with his writings?
No.
He was there's a prize given every year for the most brutal takedown. I forget what it's called, but
great.
And it's given to, and he was a TV and movie and just art critic. And did you ever see Ratatouille? The animated film, and there's the old chef.
Oh, right.
I mean, there's the old critic, of the food critic. That character is inspired by A. Gill, supposedly.
Great.
And he was just, there is a joy to be found in reading a really witty and just brutal.
Oh yeah.
Takedown,
it's the best.
Right?
Absolutely the best.
And that in it can be its own art form.
Oh yeah.
And that's what Gill did. It would just be joy to read. But that was because he was a writer. That's what was, that's what was joyous, was like reading his way he manipulated the English language. And then his object of happened to be food or art or something, but what you were delighting in was the kind of new form of art. So with the criticism, it can be a form of its own art form, I think.
Yeah.
And maybe it's difficult for people to see that, but it's often been difficult for people to see, filmmaking wouldn't have been seen as an art form for a long time. And I guess that's what people do maybe prematurely as critics, is they want to bring the attention to themselves rather than to the art piece. And that's, unfortunate and annoying sometimes, because you want to learn something about the art, not think about how clever the critic wants to come across as.
Mm-hmm.
But then, of course, when they succeed, it is fun.
Mm-hmm.
It is more than fun. It can be also illuminating in its own way, right?
I think of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf as like a relationship takedown, and the deepest, darkest line in I think Elizabeth Taylor, it must have been her, says to Richard Burton, "I'd divorce you if you existed." And I consider that to just be like the harshest takedown you could ever, like, it just hurts. It just hurts so bad. Do you have like a favorite takedown? The thing that would win your Gill Award?
Yeah, no, I wish I was better at remembering these things. Because I do delight, we've talked about this before, in just eloquence and in just like great use of the English language. Yeah. And for some reason, it's just so satisfying to hear people just destroy each other. Like, it's almost like watching a boxing match.
Yeah,
there's a great, my Best Fiend. Have you seen that? Mm-hmm. The Herzog and Klaus Kinski. I mean, one of the great things about these two friends and collaborators and just strong-headed maniacs is how brutal they were with just like destroying each other. Absolutely. And like watching them make Fitzcarraldo or something, which was just like one disaster after another. Mm-hmm. And just Klaus Kinski was just such a savage beast of a human, but still super amazing with his use of language to talk badly about Herzog, who he obviously also really loved. It goes back to this love-hate thing, right? Love by criticizing.
I had two good friends in the psychology department in grad school, and we would get coffee all the time, like, regular, multiple times a week. And one of them, who just like should be a novelist, I sincerely hope he's working on it now. But my other friend and I, we would actually pay him money. He was so good at the observed detail about a person. This is the novelistic quality that I know should be realized in him, but he just had it, and he never put it to paper, but he had it, which is he could see a scene, he could see a person, and he knew what made them tick, which is easy, but what made them hurt. Mm-hmm. And to those he loved, which is like me and this other guy, we like the three of us, like he just knew how to hurt. And we would actually do this thing where we would pay him. We'd sit around for coffee and we'd actually give him like tithings. It was $1 a minute, which is to say, if we put $1 on the table, it meant don't cut me down for the next minute. Like, I'm too fragile right now. Just like, don't do the thing that you do. Because I've never met anyone as good.
I thought you were going to say, the story was going to go that you were paying him to do it, because so Oliver Stone does this. I've had the great privilege of getting to know him over the last several years, and he loves, it's almost a hazing type thing. Like, he loves to find in everybody he like finds worthy of paying attention to, he will find your weakness. Yeah. And within an hour, he's poking at it in a way that you're both deeply uncomfortable and so flattered that he's paying enough attention to you to have found this thing about you.
It's
right?
an honor, yeah, absolutely.
And it's fun. It's a kind of like fraternal, badgering, which is both painful and pleasurable. There's a kind of masochistic quality. And I wonder if there's people who enjoy reading one of the best movie posters I've ever seen was Mulholland Drive, I think it was, or Lost Highway, I can't remember. One of the two David Lynch movies that from that period, where the poster said 2 more reasons to see Lost Highway, I think it was, and it was 2 thumbs down, Siskel and Ebert. And there was probably this delight in saying, well, if the mainstream critics don't like it, absolutely. There's a badge of honor in being hated, right? And again, better that than to be universally loved. Like I think I've quoted this great line of Francis Bacon before, of like that he said, there would be no greater condemnation of my work than everybody liking it.
Absolutely.
So if people are paying attention, if people are angered by it, if people are their feathers are ruffled by a work, in some sense it's doing its job. It'd be interesting to study things that were panned at the time of their release, and then people figured out later that it was a masterpiece. I'm sure it's happened in every art form, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll never forget the third guy in grad school, the other psychologist. He just sat down one day over coffee and just put a $20 bill down on the table without saying a word, just $20, and we just knew he needed 20 minutes. It was great.
Amazing.
It was great.
All right. Well, I think that was a good chat.
Wow, we haven't talked about criticism for the podcast.
Oh yeah. Give it to us.
Yeah, lay it on us. Let's leave it open ended. We end around now. Just lay it on us. What did we do wrong? Give it to us.
Yeah. No, because I want it. I
want
want people talking
yeah.
about it.
I'll give you $1 a minute, people.
And then somebody asked us and I'll tell you this afterwards. See you tomorrow.
See you tomorrow, everyone.